Welcome to E3 Television, and this is an outreach of Equip, Empower, and Engage School. It's a life school that we'll be launching on web, we hope soon. It's based on community, it's based on kingdom revelation. It's been based really on taking our experiences with God from places of head to places of our heart, to where we actually live out the things that we say we believe. And we welcome you to this conversation. My good friend Paul Mackie is here. He's the dean of E3 School. Never been called that before, I'll bet, but he's the creator of it. It was his dream, and he's passionate about people. Paul is an apostolic father. He loves people. If you ever get a chance to have a cup of coffee with him, go for it. Okay, well worth the time. So Paul, we've talked about a couple other things regarding the curriculum at E3 and your personal story. I wanted to talk to you now, and this is inevitable, but a lot of the stuff, the curriculum that you've written for E3, Equip, Empower, and Engage, reflects your worldview.
Yes.
Okay, so would you take a minute and just define worldview?
Yeah, so there's probably a technical definition of worldview. I'm probably not going to nail that, but what I will say is worldview would be a lot about just your perspective, the place that you stand to see things in your life or in your world. And that where you stand has a lot to do with how you think, how you feel, and what you've experienced up to that point. We could have a discussion about filters, which would be in the same ballpark, or glasses that you put on to look through and see your world. All of those things are relevant to worldview.
So would you say your worldview is also the way you interpret events in your life?
Yes, exactly right. So you're looking and you're also deciding what you think about that. So that's the interpretive process. And then you're concluding, I think, I see, I believe, this is what I conclude.
Right.
Yeah.
So personally, as a West Coast white Christian male, I have certain worldviews that those cultures have put in me.
Yes, and the same for me.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
But a worldview is not a bad thing.
No, everybody has one.
Right.
Everybody has a worldview based on where they've come from, all of those things that you pointed at, where they've lived, the family they've been a part of, if religion has been a part of that, education, life experience, it all feeds into each person's worldview.
So tell us about your worldview.
Yeah, my worldview. So we're probably going to conversate through several facets of this, but I think essentially my worldview today would be, I think, categorized by the word wealth.
Oh.
And not because I'm extremely wealthy, like checkbook, bank account, but wealthy in terms of life experience, wealthy in terms of conversations, relationships, my level of interface with the Trinity, my comfort with living with them has brought me to a place where I feel really, really wealthy.
Okay.
And so as I engage my world from day to day, I feel like I'm a man that has a lot to invest and give away.
So what would be the opposite of your wealth worldview?
Well, it would be a worldview where there's just not enough of anything.
Okay.
There's not enough love. There's not enough, quick, let's go get this because we're going to run out tomorrow. It would be a worldview where you're clinging to the small amounts of what is in fear of that there's no more.
Right.
And so you're afraid to let go of that. Even if somebody says there is more, your experience tells you, no, wait a minute, they might be lying. And again, it's not enough,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It's like with the children of Israel and manna.
Thank
Right.
you. Yeah, that's a great
that
example.
God used that to teach them that there
Yes.
was enough.
That's
He
right.
used that to shape their worldview.
Yeah. I find it interesting in that story that God actually had to tell them, hey, only get as enough as what you need today, because there'll be more tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when they tried to get more, it rotted before they could use it.
Right. Yeah.
And so how many times I can just picture somebody trying that more than once anyway, because we're still learning to trust God.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the phrases you use a lot is learning to ask really good questions.
Yes.
And how does that reflect your worldview?
Well, learning to ask good questions actually came out of it came out of a time when I realized that what I was hearing from others, what I was reading that others had written, just didn't seem to answer the question that was being, that I was carrying around inside. And so I asked God about that. And he said, well, you are made in my image and my likeness. And people think that I just know everything, I see everything, I hear everything, but they don't know that I enjoy discovery.
Oh.
And I put that in you. And it's the part of us that by design and by nature is co-creative.
Oh.
So what there is in the world right now isn't all there could be,
Yeah.
except that I've stopped creating. Once you believe that you can continue to create, then there's a whole bunch of things you don't know in the process that you have to have good questions for.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my sign painting career, I learned how to paint block letters. And there's a size of brushes that you use to do that well. And then somebody said, well, have you ever outlined one? Well, I can't use my lettering brush to do the outline. I actually need another brush. I just didn't know.
Yeah.
So I needed to ask, well, how do you do that? Well, that introduces a whole nother set of brushes that we use for fine line work. And so the creativity grows because the questions that a new set of brushes presents are not the same ones that you used to make the block letter.
So one good question will lead you into several other good questions.
Yes, and I think as I've gone along in life, getting back to your original question, where did learning to ask good questions come from? I began to get it that actually in order to keep growing and moving and maturing is not about us. It can't be a search about all the right answers. Because what you would end up with then is a head full of answers, but you have no clue how you got there. You have no clue how to use the information that supports that answer because you didn't take that trail, ask that question, process that information. And I'm recognizing that in our spiritual world, many of our religions are about providing right answers, not giving people the benefit of the trail. How did you get there?
Right.
So they don't know what to do with it, even if they have the right answer. That's where questions is so important. When you can ask questions, you take the journey of what underwrites a good answer. And that's why I love to do that. I recognize that there are a lot of people that are really smart. They know a lot of answers. But if you really put them to the test, they don't know why it's important or how they got there.
So would you think that maybe a level of trust is necessary in the questioning
Oh, absolutely,
on
absolutely.
both ends,
Yes.
right?
And I think this is where, if I go back to where we started with my worldview being wealth, what I've learned to do is trust that when I spend time with Holy Spirit and I ask my questions, I don't need to be in a rush because He's going to answer me. And generally what He'll do is He'll answer me with another question, which causes me to go farther, and then I ask another question. So this brings up an interesting worldview about prayer. So what's my view on prayer, you might say? Well, to me, prayer is not asking a question to get an answer. For me, prayer is asking a question to get a conversation.
Okay.
Because what I want to do is I want to say, God, I've been wondering about this. And then God responds back and goes, wow, that's really good. Well, I have these thoughts about this. And have you ever thought about, and then He asks me another question. And I go, well, no, I've never really thought about that. But if I had a thought, here's a couple things I think about. What do you think about that? And now we have a conversation, not just a question answer.
Right. So your worldview is very vast and very unique. I mean, we all have unique worldviews, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Mine would be a little different than yours.
Yeah.
A person who grows up, say, on the East Coast or
Right.
in South Africa would
Yes.
have different
Yes.
worldview too. How do we bridge the gaps there, where my filters would perceive something differently than someone else's?
Sure.
Where we honor their difference,
Yeah.
okay, but we still are going after something.
Yeah.
We're going after the same goal.
Yeah. So that's really a great question, and this will help our viewers also understand a little more about E3. There's a difference between teaching somebody what they should know and teaching somebody how to think. When you teach somebody how to think, you're not saying you can only look at this red pumpkin.
Right.
And we're going to talk about the red pumpkin. What you do is say, hey, there's a number of objects in the room. You might notice the red pumpkin. You might also notice the brown pumpkin, or you might notice the yellow squash. Well, what you do is you don't tell somebody that one of those is more important than the other. What you do is say, let's learn how to observe and enjoy the unique benefits of each of those objects. And so you give people a chance, and this is where I think asking good questions is helpful, because what I'm doing is I'm saying, listen, in one culture, maybe the red pumpkin is the deal. But in another culture, maybe the brown one is the deal. So I just teach you to observe these different colored topics, but I don't tell you which one's more important. I let you go discover that for yourself.
Yes.
And I think we teach people how to think. In other words, it's not all about one thing. Life is never about one thing. It's about the discovery of a whole smorgasbord of things. And so let's be open to learning about a lot of things.
So honoring another person's worldview is as important as learning to understand your own.
Yes, it is. Yes.
But it's important for us to understand our own.
Yes.
to realize that I do have a worldview and it does affect the way I interpret all the information coming at me.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think this points back to a wealth mentality. When you know that what you have is more than enough, then you're free to say, hey, Mark, what do you think about this? And it doesn't have to be what I think,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's not all about what I possess or what I don't think there's not enough of. I can actually be generous enough to say, I don't even need to bring my worldview up. I just want to know what you think. And it can be that open and that free.
Yeah, because actually, if you pay attention when people are talking, you will understand their worldview.
Well, here's what happens actually. When you live that free, it catches people by surprise. Because the predominant worldview of a lot of cultures is that there's not enough.
Yeah. So how did Jesus' worldview differ from his culture?
Well, I can offer perspective.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's multiple answers
Well,
to that
you say
question.
you talked to
but
him, so I just...
My perspective was that he knew that he was loved.
Okay.
He knew who his father was. And because he knew who his father was, he knew who he was. And so out of the resource, the wealth of that identity and relationship, he was free to come into a world that was really governed by rules and clarify, well, you say it's about this, but here's what my father would say.
Right.
You say it's about that, but here's how we see that from heaven's perspective. And you find that he was able to, with clarity, cut through the not enough mentality to show them, hey, this thing is way bigger than you guys can imagine. Would you be willing to go on this adventure?
Yeah.
And I think Jesus was radical because he was offering something that wasn't in a certain corral or confines. It was something more open and more adventurous than they could have possibly have imagined.
Yeah. In the past 5 years, how has your worldview shifted?
Well, it has grown to include, I have begun to learn that God is way more inclusive than I have been, okay?
Yeah.
And in owning that, I'll let our viewers, anyone that I'm having conversation with, whether they think that is correct or not, that's your conclusion.
Right.
My conclusion at this point in life is that as God looks across his world, he doesn't see categories of people. He only sees people made in his image and his likeness. And he said it was good when he made it. And I think that's still his opinion.
Yes. So you say this was a shift?
Yes.
A shift from what?
Yeah. Well, it was a shift from probably a worldview where there was an us and them categories.
Right.
So there's lots of us and thems. It's not just a spiritual thing. It's, I have a really great paying job, and then there are those who don't. Not thinking about that maybe they are fully rewarded with their job, and it's not like mine.
Right.
There's us and them in terms of spiritual formation. I've studied and know these things. These people don't know these things. There's all sorts of categories. I'm living as a free and legal citizen, and then there are those who are not. And so I had lots of categories for people. Some of them I agreed and identified with. Some of them I didn't agree or identify with at all. And as a result, then how I would think about them is also how I would actually end up treating them.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when God came and said, well, if I don't treat them that way, how come you do?
Yeah.
And if you're made in my likeness and my image, then how should you treat them? And that was the question that got the shift going in me.
And that increased, or it created a more inclusive worldview for
Absolutely,
you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I find out, and I've come to find out, that God is not nervous because there are differing people. There's differing cultures, differing even belief systems. That he's not nervous about that. We're nervous about that.
Yes.
That threatens us.
Yeah.
It threatens our categories. It threatens our corrals. It threatens our clubs and our groups and our particular biases and the lenses that we wear, back to the
Right.
filter discussion.
Why do you think that it's threatening?
Well, I think there's probably multiple reasons, maybe just for our purposes. I think one of the reasons is because we have a real, at least in Western culture, we have a real ingrown concept around justice and rightness. And we don't want to be wrong.
Oh,
And we're afraid to be wrong.
yeah.
We're afraid to be without an answer.
Mm-hmm.
We're afraid to be without uncertainty, without a certainty.
Yeah.
And we all our movies are about that. We want the good guys to win,
Oh, yeah.
and the bad guys to pay for what they've done. So our whole culture has this right justice system whereby we weigh right and wrong, and we're the pursuit of inclusion. Actually, it makes us have to rethink that
Mm-hmm. Big time.
big time.
Yeah.
Because there are things that we think are not in the right category. God doesn't have a problem with them.
Right. Yeah.
We put them there and said God should have a problem with it. But God didn't put it there.
So part of my process in this journey, especially around justice, is realizing that justice is not about retribution.
Yes.
Okay. Justice is
Yes.
about restoration.
Yes.
That restoration, healing, health is
Yes.
as important for the perpetrator of the crime
Yes.
as it is for the victim.
I agree.
And I think that Jesus showed us that on the cross.
Yes, he did.
Stephen
Yes.
reflected that when he was being killed. Father,
Yes.
forgive them; they don't know what they're
They're
doing.
doing,
Yeah, that it wasn't, Father, smite
Yeah.
their asses,
Yeah.
but it is bring them to a place where they can see you the way
Yeah.
I have come to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say that's probably very, very closely parallels my own. One of the things that has affected my worldview in the last 5 years is that I have finally concluded that God's not ticked off. He's just not.
Yes.
He's not angry and
Yeah.
upset.
Mm-hmm.
We put that on him. We created a theological system, a belief system, a conclusion, a certainty
Right.
that God can't tolerate certain things. And in that category, then are people who do those things. So he must not be able to tolerate them either. And what I've really recognized, because I had a huge shift around the kingdom being an organizational idea, it's not. It's a family idea.
Oh, yeah.
And moms and dads don't hate their kids if they're good moms and dads.
Yeah.
And even if the kids fall into disrepair by their own choices, actually moms and dads are called to love them all the more.
Mm-hmm.
Because love is what redeems people, not judgment.
So your worldview of God not being angry, what do you do with passages in Scripture that talk about the wrath of God?
Well, that's really the challenge, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Because wrath, again, is one of those words that, well, depending on your worldview, you're going to define it this way, or your worldview, you're going to define it a different way. So the lenses that I have on right now would be, I would say that wrath isn't about anger and judgment. I would say wrath is an extreme expression of love.
Oh, explain that.
Okay, so for instance, I remember a time in my own family where my son was in his teenage years, and he was being disrespectful to his mother. And I came down a stairway and I was listening to him talk to his mother. Now, this is a woman I love. This was a woman that together we procreated this little guy, right? And I love the little guy and I love my wife, but I am just now blowing my top over what he's saying. One person I love to another person I love. So what I did was I came down the stairs and I recognized if I was going to do this in anger, I probably would have physically hurt my son because of what was going down. And the Holy Spirit said, no, that's not how I would do it. And I had a minute of clarity and I said, then what would you do? And he said, you need to just have a face-to-face with them. My interpretation of face-to-face was that I picked my son up by his shoulders and I pinned him against the wall and I looked him in the eye, but with love I said, son, that is my wife and you cannot disrespect her that way. Do you hear my words? And at that moment, he got it. Not because I hit him, but because my heart for both of them. And he said, got it, Dad. I won't do it again. And he never did. That, to me, is a demonstration of wrath.
Yeah.
What I did was I was hating the thing he was doing. I wasn't hating him.
Big difference.
There it is.
Huge big difference,
Yeah.
yeah. Paul Young says that God's wrath burns against things that are not of love's kind.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be what frames my worldview on that right now is, and I recognize that spills over to how we read the Bible passages around the cross.
Oh.
Because I grew up in a system where God was angry.
Yeah.
And so he took it out on Jesus. And I didn't have the moment or the clarity or the questions to ask farther, but later in life I asked farther and I said, well, if I believe that trail of thought, then even though I'm forgiven, God's still mad.
Oh.
And I went, wait a minute. I thought the cross took care of everything. How do I end up with still God mad, but I'm forgiven? That doesn't gel.
Right.
So as I found my way through that, I realized, oh, actually, God didn't punish Jesus. I did. I was the one that was angry. And I was the one that put him on the cross. God didn't put him on the cross. I put him on the cross because I didn't like what he was telling me about who I am.
So that very revelation
Yeah.
is world changing.
It is.
To
Absolutely.
when God was in Christ reconciling the world.
Thank you. And we
to
should have
himself.
read that better, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we should have read that better. Shifting your worldview,
Yeah.
really, it sort of changes everything. I remember I had a friend of mine, and we were talking about the concept of victorious eschatology.
Yes.
And I'm texting back and forth with him. And he goes, Mark, if I believe this, it means I have to rethink everything.
Yeah.
And then he said, I don't have time for that. And I appreciated his honesty because he
Yeah.
saw the implications of that kind of change in your worldview.
Yes.
Okay, and that's a relatively minor one, but it's huge.
Yes.
So as your worldview shifted over the past 5 years, what does it cost you?
Yeah.
Let me
Yeah.
tag on to
No,
that.
go ahead. Yeah, that's
And
good.
and what do you do about friends and people you care about who don't understand the shift?
Yeah. Well, I think I would answer it this way. I would say that actually you hit the nail on the head already, and that is it's cost me some relationships. So having said that, I think the other thing that has cost me is I've had to stop being small. Because the Holy Spirit said, smallness will not take you where you want to go. So there was a personal price for me inside to say, I'm comfortable with small Paul because he fits in this category and I can manage all his stuff. But if I get bigger, I may not know how to navigate all of that.
Doesn't the smallness actually cut off
Yes.
the revelation and the increase
absolutely.
that you're going for?
Yes.
Because you didn't set out to change your worldview.
No.
You set out to know God better.
Yeah, I set out to know God better. And God said, it was a very actually poignant moment in my walk in the last 5 years when he said, well, so if there's more of me and more of you, then why do you keep saying, why do you keep talking to me about becoming less?
Oh,
Because that's a very favorite or a very embraced evangelical prayer.
sure. It's even in the Bible.
Yes, even in the
Right.
Bible. Yeah, Jesus, more of you, less of me.
Yeah.
And I understand the sentiment of that. I agree with the sentiment of that. That we don't become our own gods. Absolutely, that's not the point. But the point is, if Jesus is larger inside of us, I'm going to need to grow so that I have the capacity to hold the revelation he's giving me. And I need to not be afraid that I will not have the grace or the wisdom or the humility to carry that.
Yeah.
So my worldview has shifted is this. If God's going to increase his revelation of himself in me, then there's going to be more grace, more humility, and more capacity to hold that revelation.
Yeah.
And that means I have to stop agreeing with God, more of you and less of me. I now say, God, more of you. And by the way, Holy Spirit, there needs to be more of me.
Yeah. and that gives you grace to deal with relationships
It does.
that may
Misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Absolutely. See, from a wealth mentality, then I'm able to see them the way Stephen saw the people who disagreed with him.
Yes.
You know, Father, I don't want to lose these people. I don't want to lose this friendship. But neither is it my job to argue them into a different place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Just one last question.
Sure.
So, and this is a little off topic, but I think it's a good place to land because it'll create more questions.
It's okay. Yeah, more questions are good.
What do you see as our current culture's greatest challenge?
Our current culture's
Sitting here in
greatest challenge.
2019,
Yeah.
with the political arena, the
Yeah, thank
social
you.
arena, the
Yeah.
economic arena, all that, what do you see
Yeah.
as the greatest challenge for humanity?
I think our greatest challenge is going back to the concept of our country was founded on the freedom of more. We left Europe because we believed there was more, right?
Okay, yeah.
And we came here and we settled the land and discovered there was more. And now we're at this place several hundred years into our national formation. And it's interesting to me that now the discussion in our culture is about rights. And everybody's barking about, so who has the right to this, who has the right to that, who has the right to this, who has the right to that. And all of those rights discussions aren't bad, but the context is there's not enough, so let's fight over who gets what is.
Oh, that's good, yes. Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
And we're doing that in the church, we're doing that in our government, we're doing that in our businesses, we're doing that in our relationships. Who has the right to have what's left? And I want to argue for the fact that, I mean, I can just see myself just standing up and I want a megaphone to shout, there's more than you can even imagine.
Come on.
Stop fighting. Because there really is. It's not just a perspective, it's a reality. But you have to change your perspective to see that reality.
Yes, yeah.
We could end child hunger, we could end cancer, we could end, because there's more than enough for all of that. We just have to get everybody seeing it the same way. And our nation could be great again, not by arguing over who's going to dictate that conclusion, but by working together to make that conclusion true.
Yeah,
Let's all get in there and do it.
yeah.
So that's some of the answer to that question.
That is some. I know it's a big question.
It is a big question.
What is your hope?
What is my hope? My hope is that my children and my grandchildren who I'm influencing with this perspective will be able to tell and see the story progress, and maybe in another generation or two we can actually get this done and make the shift.
I share your hope.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Paul.
You're so welcome.
Yes.
Yeah.